Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 8th of June and today we're going to be discussing the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporozhye and South Donetsk. We're going to be focusing on two main areas of the front line that have seen the most activity from both sides, and so that would be the Velyka Novosilka salient and the Orikhiv Tokmak axis, which is more to the west over here, circled. And so we're going to begin in Velyka Novosilka, where I made a video previously on June 5th talking about what I described as probing attacks. And so at this point, maybe probing attacks will not be the best way to describe what occurred around Velyka Novosilka, because really in the days after June 5th, where we believed that there was this probing attack, we actually saw the launch of a full-scale offensive. And so it's possible that either that was the preparation for such an attack, like the first wave of the offensive, or that it was just the prelude to that with some probing to see where would be the best area on the front line to launch the offensive. But either way, we can say that the uptick in the fighting along the Zaporozhye and South Donetsk front began around June 5th when I made that video where I talked about the Ukrainians attacking Novosilka, Rivnopil, Storozheve, and Neskuchine. And the takeaway from that is that the Ukrainians were not able to secure any of those towns, and that the Russians were able to prove that they can maintain their forward positions in these areas. And so in the few days since then, the Ukrainians have been regrouping, and then really this next phase of the fighting in this area started on June 7th, particularly in the really late night of June 7th in Ukrainian time, and also the early morning of June 8th. And so a lot of reports were coming in around that time, which by now is like over 24 hours ago, from Russian Telegram sources in particular, and they were mentioning that there was a massive uptick in Ukrainian shelling all across the line of contact around Zaporozhye. The residents in these local areas are reporting some of the heavy shelling that they had really experienced since the beginning of the war in this area. And so a lot of different Russian units were preparing for the worst, that there would be some sort of offensive that would begin in the coming hours. And that's really what happened. And it began in the early morning, this attack, the early morning of June 28th. And as I was saying in the beginning of the video, two main areas where we saw these attacks being launched were in the Velyka Novosilka salient and around Tokmak Orikhiv axis. And so, in particular, in Velyka Novosilka, the attacks were on a very broad front. They were not just in one specific town, not aimed at one specific target. They were very wide-ranging. And so, there was fighting all across the salient, from the east to the north to the west, all along the line. You saw some very heavy fighting, and you saw Ukrainians from about 4 different brigades, I would say, that I have mapped over here. These are the 4 brigades that play the most significant role in this sector of fighting, although there are several other brigades that played more of an ancillary role in the fighting, and there's many different images of them participating, but their brigades are not really the forefront of this assault. In terms of the units that are actually the spearhead of this attack, you have 4 that are the most notable. You have the 31st Separate Mechanized Brigade, you have the 37th Separate Marine Brigade, the 68th Jaeger Brigade, another brigade which has been particularly prominent around Vuhledar, and then the 23rd Mechanized Brigade, which participated in the assaults on Novodonetsk, which occurred a couple of days ago, and we know that the Russians, they retook Novodonetsk on the 6th of June, and so that again was really a prelude to what we're seeing today. And so these 4 units, obviously they're not attacking the front line as a singular brigade. They're splitting up into company-sized teams around that size with their infantry, and then really only aided by columns of tanks and armored vehicles. And so they're lacking in a lot of the support that would be needed to conduct such a major attack on the Russian lines. Because as I was saying in my last video about this area around Velyka, Novosilka, the Russians have very, very extensive fortifications all across the front line. But what you'll notice is that in the Velyka, Novosilka area specifically, they really don't have that many fortifications on the salient itself. And that's probably because they realize that defending it might become a burden, in that if they could retreat at some point and shorten the front line, that might actually be easier, and then they might be able to hold on to it even more in the long term. And so we're still in the phase where Ukraine has not even broken through the main Russian front line. They haven't even penetrated the first Russian line of defense with all the trenches and all the ditches and all of those dragon's teeth. So the area where Ukraine's currently attacking doesn't even have any of those fortifications. They haven't even reached those yet. Those are a bit further to the south, like 14 kilometers to the south, around towns like Lyubimivka or Linske, and then around this river over here. And that's where you get the first Russian defensive line. And I say first because there's another layer under that. And there are multiple different layers. They're not all connected. They're not all cohesive. A lot of them are centered around different cities, around different highways that are important for protection. But you get the point. This, as an operation, is extremely ambitious. And from what we saw today, especially in Orikhiv, but also to a lesser extent in the Velyka Novosilka front, it seems like the Ukrainians are pouring in a lot of resources, because the brigades that they are using here, these are newly formed brigades. 23rd Mechanized Brigade. Nobody ever heard of that up until a few weeks ago when they began to be deployed to the front line. It's a new unit that was formed this year and has been at the cutting edge of a lot of Ukraine's latest training and Ukraine's latest receivement of shipping of NATO weaponry. And so these are some of Ukraine's now new elite military. This is the post-February 2022 army. And it has a lot of Western weaponry, of course, as I said before. And now it's being tested on the front lines for the first time. And as I was saying in our previous videos, this brigade and many brigades of similar ilk, they are made up of conscripts, are made up of men from other units that were disbanded. And all in all, you could see how they are the ones participating in this and not some of the older units that may have been utilized around Bakhmut. So it is very interesting. And just to get to what the Ukrainians were doing today, they conducted attacks along multiple axes. One was from Orikhiv to Stepove, another was from Novopil to Novodarivka, again fighting from Velyka Novosilka and Vermivka to the suburbs of Velyka Novosilka like Neskuchny, Storozheve. Although I have been saying that the Russians have largely retained their positions, they have been forced to cede some territory. So the Ukrainians took over some of the open fields that are in between the current front line and the previous front line. And what this means is that Ukraine has control of some higher elevation area just to the northwest of Storozheve, which could give the Ukrainians a base to conduct attacks onto that town. And because it's on a river, they could flank it and surround the Russian positions over there. And so that's potentially a threat. It's also a threat for the Russian units in Neskuchny. And then, of course, the Ukrainians could also attack from the eastern side of the river, because we have seen them make some gains over here, not taking any sort of town or anything, but they have been sending some of their armored columns in that direction. And these armored columns, they're usually, you could say, 5 to 10 different armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and tanks together. The issue is, as I was saying before, they're not receiving enough support. The Ukrainians, of course, I acknowledge that they launched a major artillery barrage in preparation for these attacks, but they can't really back up all of these individual columns one by one when they're engaging in combat or when they're trying to advance through these fields to reach a certain target. And so the Russians, they do have that capability, not only artillery-wise, but also aviation-wise. But specifically in terms of artillery, they have these large batteries all across southern Ukraine that were prepared for this, because, again, the first probing operations, as I was calling them, although we could debate it, began on June 5th. And that's when really the alert was raised about the beginning of this Ukrainian counteroffensive. And since then, they've been preparing for it, and as it began on the 7th/8th, they were already ready. And so were the Russian aviation systems. A lot of different helicopters and Su-24s were mobilized. They were active on the skies over Zaporozhye, sorties launching strikes onto different advancing Ukrainian columns and forces. And so they definitely did incur casualties, not just in Velyka and Novosilka, but also in the Orikhiv direction. And all of the factors that I just listed, in addition, you also had the factor that the Russian infantry was prepared for this, and they had different ATGM crews on the ground stationed in some of these key cities that, as I was saying before, are not even that fortified, but the fortifications that were there were still sufficient enough to prevent a breakthrough. And so those ATGMs and that Russian infantry was able to push back the Ukrainian armor in this direction, at least for now. I do think that if Ukraine continues to throw reserves and throw resources in this direction, they will eventually be successful at shortening the front line and pushing the Russians out of the salient. That would really necessitate the Ukrainians really depleting a lot of the resources that they have at their disposal, and that might take a long time, so it might be really stretched out, which is not what Ukraine wanted. They wanted a very lightning, quick hammer attack that pierced through the Russian lines and create panic and confusion and cut off the Russian land bridge. But again, from what we're seeing in the first few days, that's not happened in Velyka and Novosilka. In the area where they did achieve a breakthrough, when they crossed the river over here, this river called the Shaitanka River, very, very narrow river, so it's easy to cross. They took over on Novodonetsk, and then the next day the Russians pushed them out. And since then, the Russians have actually been gaining territory, taking back some of the open fields that they lost in this area. And so the Ukrainians have not been able to deliver in that specific area. Although you can see that I have this light blue polygon, which does show some of the Ukrainian gains. And so you can see that they have, to a certain extent, taken over some open fields. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not enough to create a major ripple effect and overwhelm the Russian defenses. And so that's all for the specific front, the Velyka Novosilka front. And now we're going to move on to the situation in Orikhiv, which I find to be very interesting because I was expecting the Ukrainian assault to initially begin in Orikhiv just because of the nature of the Ukrainian forces stationed over there and because of Orikhiv's proximity to key cities like Robotyne, and then if you go further south, Tokmak specifically, very important supply hub. You can see just by looking at the map how many different highways branch out from Tokmak to the front line. And as I was saying in previous videos, Zaporozhye is one of the oblasts with the least amount of infrastructure. A lot of the geography here is not very suitable for different sort of armored advances. And if you go a bit to the east, like in this area, there's not a lot of roads, not a lot of major highways and paved roads. And so you need to hold on to whatever you have. And if you don't have it, then it's going to be much harder to resupply at a mass scale. And so, as was the case in Velyka Novosilka, the residents in the Tokmak area reported some of the heavy shelling of the entire war. And this was followed up by Ukrainian attacks from their current positions around Stepove, Mali, Shchebaki, these towns that they were able to hold on to following Russian assaults in early 2023. And they advanced along these open fields, along these highways, and they retook the town of Lobkove. So this is actually the one town that's Ukraine succeeded in taking back so far. They did take it back for a certain period of time, Novodonetsk and Novodarivka, but both of those were retaken by the Russians. So this is the only town under Ukrainian control since the beginning of the offensive. And so the Russian forces in this area, presumably the 19th Motor Rifle Division was involved in this, but the 19th Motor Rifle Division had to move their resources a bit further to the south and station their men in these warehouses. And so this is one Ukrainian gain. The Ukrainians also made some pretty significant gains in the open fields. in between the previous Ukrainian line, which was really around this highway which connects Stepove to Novodarivka or Novoandrivka, sorry, then to Orikhiv, and then to Molotokmachka. This was the main Ukrainian line, and you could see how much emphasis was put on Orikhiv. And now a lot of the pressure has been released on Orikhiv because the Ukrainians have been able to move some of their columns southwards and take back a lot of key trenches and a lot of key fields that were previously either Russian controlled or a gray zone. And so you could see, I'm going to circle it over here. A lot of this area has recently been retaken by the Ukrainians, and they have not actually infiltrated any of the towns that Russia controls. And so in terms of towns, Russia still controls towns like Nestyarinka and Konoyalova, and they are conducting active defenses around here. And so any sort of further Ukrainian advance southwards will be met by fierce resistance, because that's when you actually reach the settlements where you do have an organized Russian defense. And it's not even the main Russian defensive line. The first Russian defensive line is a bit further to the south. We could actually open it up over here and see for ourselves. We can see that Ukraine, they'll have to pass through many different fortifications around towns like Vasilivka if they want to go through the Kamyansky routes, or if they want to continue advancing directly to the south of Orikhiv, they're going to need to break through this line over here. They're going to need to take over towns like Novofedorivka, which is fortified really on all sides besides to the north. Polohi, a major supply hub surrounded on all sides by fortifications. You can see with a major ring around it. Tokmak, a major ring around it. And it's very difficult to find an area that could be pierced at the current moment. The areas that Ukraine has taken so far have not been those red dots, those fortified areas just yet. And so let's go back and look a bit deeper into the situation. So which unit is involved in this? The Ukrainian unit that has been labeled as spearhead of this Ukrainian counterattack, there's actually an article in the Washington Post about it on the 4th of June, right before the counteroffensive, is the 47th Mechanized Brigade. This unit, again, is relatively new. I think it was formed in April of 2022. It received a lot of specialized NATO training. It also received a lot of NATO equipment, including some M2 Bradleys, some M55S Slovenian tanks, and Panthera T6 armored vehicles. And so they are being provided and trained with some of the best from the West. And that is why they were tasked with this very highly mobile mechanized assault with all of these armored tank columns and these infantrymen trained with these assaults to penetrate deep defensive fortifications and areas. That was at least the intention of it. And so we're now seeing it play out for the first time with this brigade, which is not seeing that much combat experience. Previously, I believe it was stationed around Le Mans, so it was moved sometime recently to this area from Orikhiv. There's also some National Guard brigades involved, but it's a much smaller scale, and then you have territorial defense brigades. They're not really the main focus of this, though. So the 47th Brigade, it consists of 4 battalions that have been split up and specialized with conducting attacks on different axes around Orikhiv. So you could assume that one would be around Lobkove, because that's where we saw some of the advances. One would probably be around Novoandrivka, one perhaps around Novodanilivka and around that highway, and then the last one pushing from Malotokmachka and Bielorussia to take over Russian towns like Novopokrovka over here. And so each one of these battalions has around 30 vehicles each that are then split up even smaller columns that advance through the fields. And so I know in my last video about the situation, I was saying that there was not a lot of footage to back up Russian claims of casualties. I still don't think that the Russian claims of casualties can be verified by the footage that I've seen, but I've looked through a lot of footage in the past few hours, and it's undeniable that Ukrainian columns have experienced a lot of damage from Russian artillery and also from minefields, because a lot of these fields have been under Russian control and they placed mines in them, and now the Ukrainians are just crossing through, and a lot of them are getting damaged by this. And so this does lend some credence to some of the Russian claims, which I previously doubted, and I do have to own up to it because I don't want to go out and lie about the situation. And so one incident that I found to be very interesting is that the Ukrainians are now using their Leopard 2A4 tanks provided by Germany. And the area where they were spotted was around one area of the 47th Brigade's axis of attack, around Malotokmachka, which is connected to Orikhiv. And so they were advancing along through some of the open fields in the direction of Novopokrovka. And this was done in a column with Leopards. There were also some American M113 armored personnel carriers. And so they also, I believe, had some MRAPs for carrying the infantry that were stationed here. I actually showed the video of what the Russian Ministry of Defense utilized, the drone footage that was proving this. So here's this very interesting video. It shows that at least one Leopard 2A4 tank was destroyed during their attack, but I saw reports that up to 3 more were damaged throughout these assaults. So here I'll zoom in on the video so you can see for yourself. You can see how it detonated and there were explosions as a result. So yeah, this is just one snippet of many different vehicles, not just Leopards, but also a lot of Western weaponry and a lot of old Soviet weaponry like T-64s that have been damaged due to these assaults, due to the fact that they're not being given proper cover, due to the fact that Russia has an overmatch in artillery and that there's no cover in these open fields as well, and that, as I was saying before, there's these massive minefields. And so what this indicates to me is that the Ukrainians are very serious about this assault if they're going to deploy their Leopards for the first time, because we've never seen a Leopard before in the battlefield. Those are prepared specifically in order for Ukraine to launch a highly mobile counteroffensive. And so this is just one of many signs that this is actually serious and that Ukraine's going to continue sending out these Leopards. They have dozens probably now and more being shipped in from different countries in Europe. And so we're going to see a lot of this on the battlefield. But it also proves that Leopards aren't invincible. I think everybody probably should have known that by now. But it is just a given that they will be destroyed, especially without the proper cover that maybe another NATO country like the United States would have had when they were utilizing the Leopards elsewhere in previous operations outside of Ukraine. There was also reports and a lot of footage of Ukrainian losses that were targeted by the Russians. There was an Iris-T battery that was destroyed in Kherson. This is a German air defense system. And then about 29 Ukrainian Max Pro MRAP vehicles were destroyed in recent days throughout these assaults. This was recorded by different people that have been compiling the videos and identifying the damaged vehicles. So this account is really, really good. I'm going to link this in the description, their videos, because they have here identified many different vehicles, specifically Max Pros. I see a lot of those because those are, pretty good armored vehicles that house infantry, so it's good for these mobile assaults. But you can see how many of them are being destroyed or abandoned or damaged at the very least. And so you could scroll down and see for yourself 29 armored fighting vehicles, and this person also says that there were 4 tanks that were damaged or destroyed. And so again, these numbers do indicate a pretty large assault, and if we're talking about the casualties for the vehicles, we also need to look at the casualties of the men. And so the Russian Ministry of Defense, they said that the 47th Brigade suffered about 1,500 casualties. I don't believe that. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know what's going on. I just never believe what any sort of government saying in a wartime situation. But it is undeniable that there has been dozens or maybe hundreds of casualties in these past few days with these assaults. A lot of reports from different local platoons and from local companies that they're being wiped out in these assaults due to the lack of the cover. And again, the Russian Ministry of Defense also say that about 30 tanks were destroyed. I can't confirm that. The footage doesn't indicate that, although the footage does show that at least several tanks were destroyed, which does mean that, again, the Ukrainians are suffering at least a certain amount of casualties. And so we're going to have to wait and see how this fosters I think that, again, the goal was to advance deep into Zaporozhye, into some key supply hubs like Polohi, Tokmak, and then even further south in conjunction with some sort of operation in Kherson. And that's also making me rethink my previous video about the Kakhovka Dam, because, you know, maybe this was timed in order to give either side an advantage with the dynamics on the battlefield. And there's also now new information about the seismic activity in the area around Kherson, which does indicate that there was a certain explosion in this area. And it's something that I was not aware of in my previous video, so I just want to correct the record. It does seem like at least one of the sides was responsible for conducting this, and that it maybe wasn't a structural failure. And that also adds up with the timing, because it's extremely suspicious timing that the Kakhovka Dam would explode at the same time as the beginning of the offensive. And so we're going to see how that plays out as a lot of the northern part of the Dnieper River begins to dry out, and how the flooding begins to impact Russian fortifications a bit further to the south. And so, yeah, we're going to have to wait and see about all this. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.